ceremony. Thank you for joining us today for the inaugural Paueru Gai Dialogues, Catalyzing Social Equity Through Culture and Connection to Place. My name is Izumi Sakamoto. I'm the Executive Director of Powell Street Festival Society, and I'm Hapa Sansei, third generation Japanese Canadian. My maternal grandparents are English. They settled in rural Ontario, the territories of the Mississauga, Ottawa, and Anishinaabe in the early 20th century. My Japanese Ji-chan and Ba-chan ran restaurants on Alexander Street and Powell Street in the 1920s and 30s prior to their forced removal in 1942. My father was born in Greenwood during the internment, and I was born and raised in Vancouver. I feel deeply rooted to this place, the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. I'm grateful for their stewardship of this land and water and all its creatures. Working in the downtown east side, I see many First Nations and Métis people experiencing hardships. I witness the impact of discrimination and abuse, erasure of language and cultural knowledge. Through my work at Powell Street Festival and in my daily life, I strive to be accountable as a settler colonizer and to center Indigenous knowledge and teachings as I grapple with my own legacy of dispossession. Folks have joined us today from many different places and histories. Please take a moment to reflect on your journey to the land you reside on today. Consider the multitude of stories connected to that place. Be generous, listen well, and ask yourself how you might use any privilege that you have to advance equity for all. This series is possible thanks to the financial support of HAPA Collaborative, Canada Council for the Arts, BC Arts Council, City of Vancouver, and individual donors and in-kind support from the Bulletin magazine and Element IQ. Before we get started, some housekeeping notes. We are recording the guest presentations, and these will be available on Powell Street's YouTube channel. Please turn off your camera if you wish to remain private during that section. There is a Q&A right after the panelist presentations. Please write your questions in the chat box. Also, I want to stress our priority today is to hear from everybody. We're inviting you into a circle, but we have the contextual and technological constraints that, so we are asking our facilitators in each breakout group to be a bit tough with time management. We apologize in advance. Should you wish to share more thoughts after the event concludes, we've set up a discussion on Facebook. You'll find it in the Paueru Gai Dialogues event page. You can also email us at info@powellstreetfestival.com. Now, Izumi Sakamoto. I've had many thought-provoking and reality-shifting conversations with Izumi. I've learned much from her probing questions and careful listening, and she's deeply influenced and inspired the Paueru Gai Dialogues. Izumi Sakamoto is Associate Professor at Factor Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, University of Toronto. She's a taiko drummer with Ishin Daiko and was formerly a member of the drumming group RA, Raging Asian Women Taiko Drummers. Izumi has conducted arts-informed research for over 15 years and has been leading a research project, the Japanese Canadian Arts Activism Project. Please welcome Izumi Sakamoto.
Thank you so much, Amy, for introduction and contextualizing us in this important conversation. I'm so delighted to be invited to speak and moderate today's conversation, as I love Powell Street Festival and I love Powell Street Festival Society. I'm going to say a little bit about how I came to this position, but first I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking out of what is known as Toronto Toronto, which is the traditional sacred territories of Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and Petun First Nations, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. It's important to recognize that I'm a settler colonizer, living and working and having the privilege to do so in this land, and I'm really grateful. I'm a Shin Ijusha from Japan, immigrant from Japan, and I have been living here in Toronto since 2002. prior to that, I was living in what is known as Michigan since 1993. So through the journey of being in North America, I have come to know the history of incarceration of both Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. However, as the immigrants, there was first international students in the US and now immigrants. There was a little bit of distance or the hesitation to just approach the history as in that sort of as an immigrant. So, but that over time, since when I started getting involved in taiko drumming through Raising Asian Taiko drummers, I learned more about Yellow Power movement started in late 60s and early 70s that had huge impact on the Asian Canadian and Asian American communities. And through that, I started seeing the connection to that movement and to many of the Sansei who are in that movement. So with that, I would like to start the slides. Tracy, please. Oh, Sammy, sorry. So next slide, please. So I've been leading a project called Japanese Canadian Arts and Activists Project, in which has many people who are involved, and many of the people who are here today have helped out in many different capacities. So I really acknowledge that and thank you for contributions. And it's been really a great journey for the past 3.5 years. Next slide, please. The history of incarceration, many of you who are here today know much more, but during World War II, 21,000 Japanese Canadians were uprooted, incarcerated, and displaced due to Canadian government's racist policies. In 1977, in order to rebuild community and reclaim space, a group of activists, artists, and community leaders came together to create what is to become the Powell Street Festival. Run largely by volunteers, Powell Street Festival, now in its 44th year, is the most vibrant celebrations of the Japanese Canadian community in Canada. And the Powell Street Festival also is intimately tied to the vital Japanese Canadian artist scene that are pushing back on the victim narratives and reclaiming the space through the art and reclaiming identity through their artwork. And here you see the work by Lillian Michiko Blakey and Emma Nishimura. Next slide, please. And here are some pictures from Powell Street Festival, as well as long-time volunteers. Many of them are here today. The Powell Street Festival, first time I went was 4 years ago, and I was just blown away. Coming from Japan, I have been to many festivals. However, here this was a community-based festival on steroid with 20,000 people or more of Japanese Canadians, Asian Canadians, and the other people who are just interested in this festival. As Mayu Takasaki said, something for everybody. And even though I was a foreigner, like visitor, colonizer, newcomer to the land, and Vancouver, that was the first time I went, I felt like I was coming home, which was a strange feeling, but it was just super fun, exciting. And it has so many things for me and for everybody I could see. It showcases music, visual arts, crafts, theater, martial arts, pop culture, literature, history, scholarly work, activism, food, community booth. It was just lots and lots of things. And the organizing body of Powell Street Festival, Powell Street Festival Society, sustained grassroots organizing and arts-based activism have been crucial in facilitating space for Japanese Canadians to define and revitalize their history, our history and community in response to the multi-generational effects of state-sanctioned racism. So here that some of the pictures are not all from Powell Street Festival. Tsunagu was the event. Lucy Komori and Kani Kadota with the help of Nikkei National Museum. Sherry Kajiwara pictured on the left with Lucy and Connie are pictured organized to have intergenerational conversations. And this kind of, so Lucy and Connie are also founding members of Katari Taiko, which I'm gonna get to. And there are lots of things that are written, and I have received many interesting and exciting stories. I can't share all of them, but I'm gonna just touch on some of them today. Next slide, please. So for the nerdy people out there like me, this is the research project. So it's a community engaged collaborative praxis research, which is action and reflection going hand in hand. And the research team did a lot of soul searching and identity exploration ourselves as well, because people have done so much work already through Powell Street Festival for the past 44 years. So to face that, we also had to do that work. And our identity or our positionality as a settler colonizer also came into place, and myself also as Japanese ethnic facing the imperial legacy, colonizing legacy as Japanese national, Japanese ethnic also came into picture quite a bit too, thanks to many insightful conversations with Sho Tanaka, who's on the team. So we talked to many people. We also looked into archival materials, books, many things, audio tapes from 90s. And here are some things I would like to share. Next slide, please. One of the amazing things that I found out through this research is the existence of Asian Canadian Coalition, which was a group of Japanese Canadian and Chinese Canadian students at UBC coming together, politicized, and being part of Yellow Power movement, following the teachings of Ron Tanaka, who was a professor at UBC, professor of English at UBC. And that politicization of students in the community by Asian Canadian Coalition set the ground for what is to come, like Powell Street Festival, like what is like feeding into Tonarigumi. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Tonarigumi, as many of you in Vancouver know, but those of you who don't know, it's a Japanese Community Volunteers Association, which has been around since '74. It's a really community-based, amazing community agency, initially created to work with, to serve Issei seniors, first generation seniors. Jun Hamada, pictured here, is a Nisei man who was instrumental in starting this agency, which is still thriving, working with seniors, and not only seniors, but it was a drop-in place for many people who are looking for, young Japanese Canadians who are looking for their identities, a place to be, and sort of creating the intergenerational connections, and while working with the seniors as well. Next slide, please. Tonarigumi got the grant so this is Tamio Wakayama, the prominent photographer and also somebody who was instrumental in Powell Street Festival. And Tonarigumi, it was like the salmon returning to their original spawning beds, and epicenter of that particular activity was Tonarigumi. So people after the war didn't have the place to be, didn't have a community or home like it was before the war. And Tonarigumi it contributed to the sense, creating the sense of home. Then Tonarigumi also started what was to become Powell Street Festival. Next slide, please. This is the first Powell Street Festival Japanese Canadian Centennial. And without Tonarigumi, this wouldn't have started. And with the huge sort of volunteers, Asian Canadian Coalition, and young Japanese Canadians coming together to uplift this festival, And this was to continue 44 years, which I don't think nobody ever knew. One of the amazing things that the creators of Powell Street Festival did was to listen to their own voices, listen to their own faces, like see their own faces and create their own history, create their own identity through efforts like this, Powell Street Festival, like slide tape that Connie and Lucy created would be one of the examples. And having the pictures shown from incarceration that people haven't still seen at that time, and getting the stories out and connecting the history, then that made the grounding of the identity possible. Next slide, please. And another amazing thing about Powell Street Festival is it gave birth to Canadian taiko scene. That the first group from Japan played taiko, the big Japanese drums. And next year, San Jose Taiko came from San Jose, US. And the Connie Kadota, Lucy Komori are cited here. And they were amazed that Sansei, third generation Japanese Americans are doing this. So they too can do it. So that's, and also they presented different ways to be Japanese Canadians. They are politically aware. Many of them were ACC members, Asian Canadian Coalition members, and they were also connected to history. They wanted to uplift each other. They wanted to cultivate women's leadership and queer presence. Many things are already there in Katari Taiko, which was today then be represented in Powell Street Festival, as most of them are, many, like all of them are volunteers at Powell Street Festival. Some of them became coordinators, and without them, Raising Asian Women wouldn't have existed. And without them, Powell Street Festival wouldn't have had so many relevance and presence. Next slide, please. These are some of the pictures. This is seen from the Powell Street Festival. And this is how people have become, created their own identity through Powell Street Festival. Next slide, please. This is from the archival footage. So I think Powell Street Festival is almost a necessity for the Nikkei community. You really get feeling better about yourself. Dick Nakamura. Next slide, please. And this is a quote from Naomi Shikaze, who was also a member of Asian Canadian Coalition. It was like they were putting something of themselves into the ground. And then somehow the festival kind of emerged from all of that. So even though Issei and Nisei were dispersed from the Powell Street grounds, Nihon Machi, but they had something there, and Sansei and later came back and was able to pick it up. Next slide, please. This is Kathy Shimizu's quote from the interview that Nicole Yakashiro did, who's present today as a volunteer. Part of my loyalty and dedication to Powell Street Festival comes from this idea that arts are part of the glue. Arts and culture have super important role in all our work because of, for one, they build community. They have a level of ownership that is pretty unique. And that's also another thing I was amazed that Sawagi Daiko, Kazai Taiko members have to volunteer at Powell Street Festival, but I think they would gladly do so. And how I can't imagine going back to the same festival 44 years straight to be the volunteer, but many of them do. So as many younger people, that's another amazing thing about Powell Street Festival. Next slide, please. Golden Kadota was also instrumental in supporting Powell Street Festival. They cannot deny that festival is a prime expression of Japanese Canadian presence. Even they can identify that, the presence, because in that festival, there's part of early generational Japanese Canadians somewhere in there. So it's also connecting to the history, not to the place alone. Of course, Powell Street is where Japantown was pre-war. Next slide, please. sorry, I messed up the slide. I can't read it, but this is a scene from I Knew Dancers from that came in 2019. This is a picture by Kayla Isuma. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Jodaiko. Beneath the colorful kimonos, the visceral beat of taiko and the tantalizing aroma of teriyaki salmon is a serious and passionate attention to affirm our cultural legacy and to lay the groundwork for our future. So this is again from Tamio Wakayama. Next slide, please. And this is from Powell Street Festival website. We acknowledge and respect the concerns of the homeless and community residents in Oppenheimer Park area, which is where the center of Powell Street area, located on unceded Coast Salish territory. For this reason, the Powell Street Festival Society will not use the area of Oppenheimer Park where the protest is taking place and does not support the removal order of the threat of removal of residents in the park in any way. So Downtown East Side Community Care Program. Next slide, please. So this dedication or resolve to connect with the residents who are now there in, because Japanese Canadians were displaced and coming back to Japantown and recreate the space, revitalizing Japantown cannot be replacing the people who are calling the area home. So this is an amazing project done by Audrey Kobayashi and Jeff Masuda and Revitalize Japantown in collaboration with Nikkei National Museum. The right to remain community fair approaches art as a means for shared debate, healing pleasure and pain, and understanding of what it has meant and meant to survive in the downtown east side in the past, present, and future, using the tools of human rights and art making. Next slide, please. So community organizing is using art to elevate the voices of the community residents and also create the connection with Japanese Canadian community and the local residents, which is the work, part of the work that represents Powell Street Festival's commitment. Just take the Powell Street Festival as an example. Every year, this festival is a celebration of the value of this neighborhood. Many attend to remember and celebrate what it once was, the cultural hearth of all Japanese Canadians. For others, the festival is also a celebration of what the downtown east side continues to be, a place where people of all ancestries and relations who have been targeted by an often hostile and uncaring society have always come to find refuge, protection, support, and community. Next slide, please. So what does all these things mean? That I think it's really amazing. Powell Street Festival is just so amazing because there's a centrality of social justice principles passed down through long-term community volunteers influenced by Asian Canadian movements like Asian Canadian Coalition. And openness to embrace a wide range of cultural expressions and identities. So genderqueer, gender bending, trans folks still have presence in the presence in the festival, not like marginalized in many other cultural heritage festivals. And Taiko has a huge part of that to put out this amazing energy from people of different shapes, sizes, and identifications. And here we see Linda Uehara Hoffman, who was the co-founding member, the earlier member of Katari Taiko, and also founding member of Sawagi Taiko as well. Generosity to welcome the leadership of younger generations. There's always openness. For example, when I stepped into Powell Street Festival for the first time as a newcomer, people were just so open to talking to me. It was helping me connect to different people. That kind of generosity and openness often is really hard to see in many other organizing efforts. Outreach and collaboration with local residents, which I talked about, and recognition of historic and current colonialism and where we stand as Japanese Canadians. Next slide, please. This is Terry Watada playing from early years. It was all there. The ghosts of Little Tokyo had encircled the Powell Street Festival to welcome back the Japanese Canadian community. It's from Kikyo, coming home to Powell Street. Conclusion from my piece is community continuity is embraced by embracing change and working through differences, which is hard to do. When you have thousands of Japanese Canadians come together, there are differences, but to come back once a year, you negotiate the differences, you make it work. And that year after year for 44 years, just amazing. Anti-oppressive social justice values are woven through. No obvious corporate sponsorships, and it's a community's festival. Potentiality is art to facilitate community building. Art is used throughout this organizing efforts. And this vision, tenacity, and camaraderie of people who are involved is also amazing. And I know this also different gender presence, small tournament for women. I love that too. It's not like many traditional Japanese festivals. So thank you. It is a struggle for Powell Street Festival because we are a Japanese Canadian festival. We are not a Japanese festival. So every year we try to bring some kind of a performer to the festival who I'm sure the outside world would not see as being traditional Japanese culture. And I agree, it's not. And this is where we talk about self-determination. We determine what our culture is. Katari Taiko is not traditional Japanese culture by Mayumi Takasaki. I think this point is really important. So, or else there's always, you need to look to somewhere else to look for identity. But this is the Japanese Canadian festival, and this is the showcase in our Japanese Canadian art, craft, and culture. And that's what is so amazing about, wonderful about Powell Street Festival. Next slide, please. And there are some references. And here again, Linda Uehara Hoffman of Katari Taiko from 1981. I love this picture, so much energy and captures so much of Linda, but also what Taiko represents for many of us. Next slide, please. So these are some of the references. Next slide, please. And that's my email. Okay, so there was one comment. What is that traditional Japanese culture? You're right, Ren, Nicole, you got me. Japanese culture can be many different things. So I shouldn't have said that traditional Japanese culture. However, when we see many Japanese cultural festivals in North America, that we see artists from Japan representing the culture, and it's not about Japanese Canadian culture. So that's what I meant to clarify. So that's it for my portion. And now we turn to amazing speakers. And we have 3 people speaking for 7 minutes each, which is not a lot, but we get to hear what they have been doing. And so if you can finish this slide, Tracy, thank you so much. Oh, Sammy, thank you so much. And next speaker we have is Terry Watada. Many of you know Terry Watada. He's a writer, poet, and one-time musician. His latest publications are The Four Sufferings, poetry, it's a poetry, and The Mysterious Dreams of the Dead, which is a novel that you're seeing the cover picture. It was also published last year, 2020. Many of his writings reflect upon his Japanese Canadian identity, and several of his books were set in the historic Japanese Canadian community of Paueru Gai, downtown East Side neighborhood. He was a featured performer at the inaugural Powell Street Festival in 1977 and has been a supporter ever since. And he has been featured as a writer reading from his novel. And also he was an organizer for the redress in 80s. And we also owe him quite a bit as an advisor to our Japanese Canadian arts and activism projects. Terry, please help me. Welcome, Terry Watada.
Thank you, Izumi-san. Can everybody hear me? I think. Okay, well, no answers, but that's okay.
You're good.
Okay, good. I want to say hi to a lot of the people that I know and also the people that I don't know. It's really nice to see you. And thank the organizers of this dialogue. It's really well done. Anyway, to continue with my 7 minutes, in talking to Izumi the other day, I suddenly realized that I've been writing poetry, prose, songs, plays for the past 50 years. And I don't want to say I'm old, but I will say I'm ancient. And back in how it all started, anyway, most of this stuff is about Japanese Canadians and Asian Canadians. And it started in 1970 when I gave up playing music in bands and the top 10 radio hits at the time. And so the rise of the singer-songwriter like Joni Mitchell, Carole King, Paul Simon inspired me to try to write my own music. But and I took that old adage, write what you know. And I suddenly realized I didn't know a lot, and the first songs were really terrible. And then in 1972, the first Asian Canadian Experience Conference took place in Toronto, and I helped out there, and I played some music, and I also saw, anyway, to my experience, the first photographs from the internment era, and it had a profound effect on me, and I realized that there's a whole history I didn't know. So I immediately went to my mother and asked about that period, and very typically she called me a baka, and which means idiot, by the way. And I said, "Well, okay, I'll. You don't want to talk about it. What about how did you meet Dad?" And again, she said baka, and I don't need to know that stuff. And I was at a dead end, but I kept at it and kept asking. And finally, both my parents started opening up about that whole era and that whole experience. And I realized that how much I had lost and others of my generation, an entire community. I mean, there was a vibrant, cohesive community in Vancouver and up and down the BC coast pre-World War II. And I started realizing that there's also a community, Toronto Japanese Canadian community at Spadina and Dundas at that time, which is downtown Toronto, Chinatown today. And there are places like the Ginza restaurant where you can get ochazuke and tsukemono for real cheap. You could go to Nikko Garden for a very formal Japanese restaurant experience. You can go to, there were the grocery stores, Furia and Dundas Union and several others. There was the Japanese language school down there. The first Buddhist church was in that area. And it was just all lost. I mean, the Toronto J-Town is slowly gone away. In fact, it's all gone now. But I decided that it was time, or I should attempt to resurrect that community in my songs, in my writing, and I want the Nisei to feel whole again, and I want the Sansei to feel in about their past. And I think the last thing I have to say is that I've faced criticism in the past about why I should write about one thing and one thing only. My answer to that is William Faulkner wrote 12 novels, 12 full novels about one county in Mississippi, and they gave him the Nobel Prize. Now, I'm not saying I'm good enough to win the Nobel Prize, but there's nothing wrong with writing about one thing in particular. Thank you. Hello?
Hi, yeah, sounds like you still have a minute left.
Oh, I thought I had. Well, I will say that writing about it and all the Sansei and Nisei exploration or revelations of that period gave substance to the redress movement, made it a valid issue. And I think that's what makes it so important to put into art our experiences and our history. Is my minute up?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's perfect.
Okay, good.
Whenever I talk to Terry, I learn so much from him, and there's so many stories that he holds. He has photographic memory of everything, it seems. So now we are on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Kathy Shimizu. And Kathy Shimizu is a sensei and graphic and web designer, artist, and community organizer. She has worked for the Powell Street Festival Society in various roles since 1991, and is a co-founder, collective member, and administrator of We Press. And she serves on the Greater Vancouver Japanese Canadian Citizens Association Human Rights Committee, and she's also a member of Sawagi Taiko. She works to use the importance of history and the power and joy of arts and culture to build community, fight for social justice and change, and help create space for the voices of communities and individuals marginalized by our existing systems. And those of you who know Kathy, she's always working, she's always organizing, she's always helping other people. And at the festival, she's always working, so she never gets to see something on the stage. But I also, Kathy is another person who holds so many stories. Really looking forward to hearing her story. Please help me welcome Kathy Shimizu.
Hi, everybody. Oops. Hi, I'd just like to acknowledge I'm on the unceded and stolen and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And thank you all for coming. This is so amazing. I can't believe how many people joined this Zoom today. And I really want to thank Amy and Sammy and everyone at Powell Street Festival for asking me to be on the panel. And it's really an honor to be here with Terry and Ayumi. Really amazing artists, and thanks Izumi for that great intro to Powell Street Festival and hosting. And I want to say that my talk is nowhere near as polished as Izumi's, and I'm definitely going to go over time because I have too many slides, but I'm just going to keep going anyway. So I don't really consider myself a professional artist with a specific discipline practice. Do like to make a lot of stuff, and I think you can see from my studio that's the case. But the first slide was a print of Powell Street Festival, and but I realized what actually I've been practicing and developing over the past 30 years is really arts-based community building, and it was completely unplanned. And so I would just want to share some, pivotal moments in my life that kind of led to this work. And I think the power of 5 important things. And in this slide, it's a print that I made to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Redress. And really, I really believe in the power of community and working collectively, in the importance of place, in the importance of history, arts, and culture in our lives, in the critical need to be political, and the importance of advocacy, and really mostly solidarity, and really the power of art and activism. So in this print, actually, you can see you can't really tell. There's all these amazing leaders from the redress movement, but at the front there is Terry, and the dark is actually Terry Watada in that dark suit, and Diane Kadota holding his guitar, and other people from, Powell Street Festival. So it's kind of come full circle for me. So the next slide, Sammy, is really the power of community. Is really my family is my first and most supportive community, and I'm just really so lucky. And I had so lucky to have such great parents and uncles and cousins and aunts and that my the cousins and their kids, and so it's really a wide community. And so I'm a Sensei, born and raised in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. And the second thing around power of place is that my dad's dad, or my granddad, was Reverend Kusaburo Shimizu. He was the minister at the Japanese United Church that used to be at the corner of Powell and Jackson, where the Buddhist temple is now. And my mom's family lived in Collingwood, and they, came to the neighborhood to go to that church and to shop and to go to the language school. So I have these really strong historical family ties, personal family ties to the neighborhood. But also, I've really been thinking about our ties to the land and why decolonizing work is really important to me, and acknowledge my role as a settler colonizer, and sort of just because we're part of Canadian society. And so constantly sort of trying to address that and work against it. And then the really the power of history and art and cultural practice is so important to our joy, but also at the core of resilience. And so the reason I have this photo of my family, which is, I think a lot of us could probably relate to growing up in places where there weren't that many other Japanese Canadians. But the key pivotal moment was when our parents made us volunteer at Folklorama, which is a multicultural event in Winnipeg. And oh, sorry, I was going to go to the next slide, but and then of course at Folklorama there was taiko, so Hinode taiko. So the photo of me, so I joined Hinode taiko, and of course life-changing. And anyone, you all know when you first hear taiko, it's like, oh my god, this is amazing. So joined Hinode taiko, and managed to get into the Winnipeg Free Press in my early days. And then when I moved to Vancouver, was super welcomed by all the people who were in Katari taiko at the time, who were amazing and inspiring. And now I drum with Sawagi taiko. But that was a super pivotal moment. And then the other side of it is that the power of that, history and art and culture is that, as Izumi said, as a member of Katari taiko, you had to volunteer for the Powell Street Festival. So can I have the next slide? So when I started, I was doing stuff like helping paint faces in the kids tent, and sort of oblivious what's really going on, but volunteering like everybody else, doing a shift. And then somehow in 1995 I became the coordinator. And then once you are involved in the back end of the festival, it changes everything. So after that, since then I've been trying to help. I do lots of different roles, but it was another thing. It was like Izumi said, the first time I ever went to the Powell Street Festival, it was amazing. I couldn't believe it. Was like, oh my god, what is this? And it was so incredible to me, and it's had such an impact on the work I do and why I do it. So next slide. So then I've used my art and design, next slide, to help promote the festival and do different kinds of work here. Next slide. But then another super pivotal thing was we moved to Philadelphia in 2005 and 2006, and we lived there for 5 years. And so the power of being political and the importance of advocacy and solidarity is something that I learned just from my amazing friends at this super righteous group, Asian Americans United. And I know some of you folks are on the chat, on the call. So and this is because Tamio Wakayama from Powell Street Festival and Ed Nakawatase from Asian Americans United worked together in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South Indian Civil Rights Movement. And so this really was an incredible connection for me. And then the work with Asian Americans United was so inspiring, and I learned so much. Next slide. So again, they have a festival, Chinatown Mid-Autumn Festival, and it was really great. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences, but I was able to help. The next slide, Sammy. shows, so I, again, could use my art and design to support the festival. And oh, it's probably, I think it's spinning its wheels. Oh yeah, so I made a lot of posters. And the next slide. But the thing I learned was around the organizing and the political work, which was incredible. These photos are by Harvey Finkel, and they show, oh, sorry, they show South Philly High, amazing activists who fought against the administration because there was so much violence and they weren't doing anything. So that changed a lot of things. So when I came back to Vancouver, I had a whole new perspective on how I wanted to be involved in the Powell Street Festival. And then I joined the Advocacy and Outreach Committee, which is a committee that was formed so that we could have a year-round presence in the neighborhood and not just like drop in for the festival. And so Sawagi had developed a relationship with SOCAM, Indigenous drumming and singing and dancing group. And so next slide, Sammy, you can go through the next few. So Taiko then became a way to also work with the Indigenous community. John and Greenaway initiate this amazing collaboration. Then the next slide shows called Against the Current, that involved drummers and Indigenous people. Then there's Doran with his fish and art making in the downtown east side. And the next slide. And then, that we can use Taiko at rallies. This is with a fight for the Balmore on the Regent, right on Wendy's on the call, and the right to remain work we've been doing, fighting for housing in the downtown east side. And so the next slide shows the hotels that were eventually condemned to cities actually bought them now. So drumming for social justice, that's the next slide shows. Also the Insight, the first safe injection site in the country. And this is Sawagi Taiko with Yes Kage drumming with us. And the next slide. And that idea of bringing art and activism together. So we formed an organization called We Press, next slide, which has been heavily supported by Powell Street Festival. We do a lot of collaborations and we have a space in the downtown east side. We give a lot of free art workshops and bring art making resources to the community. Sam, you can go to the next one, next few slides. You can sort of keep going. So you can see we do engage people. Art and culture is such an entry point. This is our space we share with Gallagher Shea. Social housing upstairs. And next slide. And we do, you can go through the next couple. We hold projects and bring people together to make art, including at the reconciliation walk. That artwork is by Kuigwe Iwans. And next slide. Oopsie, sorry. And then when COVID hit, things really escalated in terms of networking. Now we were working with folks to distribute meals. We Press started a community kitchen. We cook 200 meals a day, Mondays to Fridays at the Japanese language school. It's a really great partnership. Next slide. And the networking, we work with all sorts of frontline grassroots organizations, which then allowed us during Powell Street Festival to make 1,750 care packages out. That's the SRO Collaborative folks there, that we could get out to the neighborhood through all these partners. Next slide. And even when we're working, we're doing cultural practices and taking time for art. And it culminated in the giving ceremony at this year's festival, the last two slides, where Powell Street Festival really is for the Japanese Canadian community and the downtown east side community and lots of other folks. So the last slide I just wanted to share was Yuri Kochiyama. Consciousness is power, consciousness is education and knowledge. Consciousness is becoming aware. Tomorrow's world is yours to build, because I feel like so profound, because once you know what's going on and once you understand what the kinds of things that could be done, you really can't go back. So it really informs why I do what I do. So thanks everybody. Sorry, it's a bit long.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was just fascinating how much you have done in your lifetime. you covered like huge ground. So I love to hear more, but now we have to sort of move on. Next speaker is Ayumi Goto. Ayumi Goto is a performance artist currently based in Toronto, traditional territories of Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Born in Canada, she often draws upon her Japanese heritage and language to creatively challenge sedimented notions of nation building, cultural belonging, and activism. Working collaboratively, she explores land-human relations, in-betweenness, collective responsibility, and spatial-temporal play. Ayumi is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto. I first met Ayumi at Toronto Biennial, where she was putting on amazing performance art, really exploring what it means to be colonizer with her colleague, Peter Morn. And that was really amazing and beautifully done collaboration work. And since then, I'm really inspired by her work. Please help me welcome Ayumi Goto.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be invited to be part of this panel with Terry and Kathy and Izumi. And I'm very grateful to the Powell Street Festival. Oh, please stop the slides. Can you put the slides in manual if possible, instead of automatic play? Thank you. Can you go back to the first slide? Thank you. So today, I'm going to just talk about because I was thinking about my relationship, and it has been something that I've been thinking about for quite some time now, my relationship to place and space as I pass through different lands and different territories. I see performance art as a form of witnessing, an active form of witnessing, thinking about ways in which, oh, I don't know what just happened. That's not one of my slides, but it is a very beautiful pattern. But thinking about it in terms of witnessing and how I can respond when I witness something, someone, some being, some vibration or some relations in a way that's respectful to that which is being witnessed. So the first slide. Oh, I don't know what's going on. I don't know. The slides are no longer here.
I'm having them up in 1 second. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking today just briefly about a performance I did called Rinrigaku, which means ethics and collected responsibility. And I was invited by an artist. So if you can go to the second slide, if possible, Sami or Tracy. I can start to talk about it, and then it's a performance where I define collected responsibility because I've been thinking a lot about what is our collective responsibility, especially if we're guests or passing through in different territories, and there's a history of colonization and a history of oppression of others, so that our presence becomes known, and so our presence, and that's why we're there. But in terms of collected responsibility, I'm not thinking about that which we do actively or intentionally, but I think about that which we collect along the way, either intergenerationally or personally, things such as a political history that we have inherited, maybe some cultural practices, socially and spiritually, what comes upon us as we move from different places and different engagements with people. I don't know if the slides are working. I don't know if I can maybe share my screen.
Sami, I think you're muted.
Should I try to share my screen?
The slides
Okay.
are just still loading on my end, so apologies.
No problem. It's no problem. It's a strange time. It's a strange way to do a panel, I think. So I'm just going to share my, I think, is my screen shared now?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about this, everybody. I'm also not very computer savvy, so please forgive my inelegant presentation. So in this performance, I was gifted by, and thinking about what I had collected, one of the things I had collected is bamboo gifted to me by my mentor and dear friend, Roy Miki. And he was just moving house, and I think he forgot afterwards that he had given me the bamboo. But I remember big bamboo forests in Kyushu and just across Japan. And one of the goals that I have in a performance is to think about what would make my mother laugh. And because we grew up, like I grew up in a multi-Asian mushroom farm setting in Alberta with multiple Asian diasporas because of the mushroom farm that my parents owned. In that space, my mom couldn't speak English very well. And so often my mom and dad both, as well as my grandmother, she never learned English really. So in that space, my sisters and I became sort of mini like children translators. And I've learned since then that when you're learning another language, humor is one of the last things that is transferred or is comprehensible because of all of the different intricacies of a language. So it's been my challenge doing performance or coming up with performances to make a space for my mom and people at the farm and people like at the mushroom farm, that they would see a performance without any words and that they would start laughing really hard. Because in growing up in a rural environment, we're often shamed if we're speaking our own mother tongues in public places. And so my mother, I would say, lived a fairly muted existence in many ways, and not being able to participate publicly in many facets of that area in rural Alberta. But in this performance, I was asked by Amish Morale to join a group show called Outdoor School. And it was really an opportunity for me to think about that which I carry no matter where I go. And beyond the playfulness of it, so I picked 3 locations. The first day, there was no camera, no footage. And I went to a sacred space in Toronto area where many Indigenous communities would meet, both before and after European colonization. And I laid some tobacco there to say that I was going to pass through for a little while. The second day, I ran to the nuclear power plant, the Pickering nuclear power plant, and that's Amish right behind me, running with me, because he could see, he knew the route, the way. And one of the things that, besides, like, at first it was very Yankee, like exciting to have this bamboo connected to me, because suddenly my whole body shape changed. And suddenly I was 7.5 feet tall versus 5 feet tall. And it really made me think, and I felt a real responsibility to the bamboo. And it was a very sunny day and I didn't want the leaves to scorch. So as I was running along the lake, I would crouch down from time to time and very slowly dip the leaves into the water so they could be refreshed. And it really made me think about what were the, like in many cases and cultures, what are the actual practical beginnings of that which becomes ritual. And it was a real meditation on that. In the second day, this is the run to the nuclear power plant. Like I was saying about collective responsibility, I have 2 things that I have collected intergenerationally. One is a strange relationship to nuclear power, nuclear energy, because of the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And in a almost irreconcilable way, in a very difficult way, I have this haunting or this sense of responsibility because my maternal grandparents and my grandmother is the one who raised me. Who came to Canada to raise really the whole family, including my mom and dad. But she and my grandfather lived in China for 11 years. And my grandfather knew the reason why he was there was he was hired by the Japanese government as a contractor to build an attack bridge into Manchuria. And my grandmother, she never knew why she was in China. And she would tell me like stories of her servants or her Chinese friends. And she didn't understand the consequences, the traumatic consequences and the scope of it to that Japanese imperial colonization had to the rest of Asia. So this was my way to think about how and when she was in China too, as well as when she was in Canada and Japan, she was the good citizen and she was meaning well, trying to fulfill the duties as a good wife and as a good citizen. But it really made me think like, what are the limitations of being a good citizen? And in what ways can we trouble our habit or this idea of caring if it does cause damage to those that we haven't imagined or who we do not consider to be part of our community? And this performance was in response to, or it was in continuation of a project that I did in collaboration and in deep consultation with my dear friend and mentor, Shola Rondell, who's a Cree Métis singer-songwriter. And she talks about La Rondelle, her surname, which means swiftly flying songbird. And she talked to me a lot about what it meant for her being a guest on different Indigenous territories and how to get permission to go across, this land we call Canada. And so I was thinking about what it would be like to be her sound or sonorous shadow. And as a songwriter, Shell has traveled across the country to write songs in Vancouver Songlines. She did a series there, in Toronto Songlines, and the Nikamuck songs, which she created an album when she traveled across Saskatchewan with her dear friend and collaborator, Joseph Netaho. And so what I did is, with her permission, I made a belt, a sound belt, and I strapped 3 speakers around my body. And it was really an experiment to see how I could really change my relationship to the land, because I didn't know about a lot of the territories that I was on before. And I wanted to do it in a way that was quiet, or it was, there was music going around, but that it was not so intrusive, so that I could pass through the territories without causing harm, hopefully, as I passed through. And I ended up at the end of 104 days and running 1,600 kilometers. I ended up in Vancouver at Oppenheimer Park. And when I lived in Vancouver, Oppenheimer Park was just a place that I kept being pulled to. And I continue to be interested in this space because it's such an intersection of so many different communities, cultures, events, experiences, including Powell Street Festival. And I wanted to make an act to honor that space and those histories there. And on the very last day of the 104-day run experiment, there was a woman there who happened to be there with her drum, and she didn't know what I was doing there, and I didn't know what she was doing there, but it was like she welcomed me back, and I started to cry because it was a very, very emotional and grueling experience of trying to get to know the land. Right now, where I'm living with my best friend, my dear friend, Peter Moore, and Chelton First Nation artist and object maker, and my partner, Ashok Mathur, in Toronto. And so a couple of years ago, Peter and I collaborate a lot together, and I do consider him a dear mentor to me as well. And he and I were thinking about what it meant to be guests in this territory, so Treaty 13. And I didn't know until I moved to Ontario that there were 46 treaties that were signed in Ontario over history. And if you look at the lines, they're so boxy. And I thought it just seems like an unnatural carving out of the land. And so we're thinking about what it meant to be guests. And in our performance called Roaming, we're thinking about the meaning of Dik Garunto, which means the place where the trees stand in the water. And we're trying to think about how we could pass through this space as, and Peter's from the Crow clan, and I really affiliate with Salmon, and thinking about how we as diasporic beings, part human, part not human, can be present and politically aware of the lands that we're standing on. And while I was doing the Nishu runs initially, I learned about this amazing woman named Josephine Mandamin, and she, like 1,600 kilometers sounds a lot to run, but she ran, walked around, circumnavigated all of the Great Lakes. That's 17,000 kilometers. And she also walked along the St. Lawrence River up to where it opens up to the Atlantic Ocean. And as she has explained in interviews, and as some of my Anishinaabe friends have explained too, the women are considered the carers of the water and protectors of the water. And so when I moved to Toronto, I had such a strong feeling of in these like running experiments that, you know, how would I walk so that I would walk in her footsteps and the footsteps of the generations of women who have looked after this land. So yes, if you haven't heard of her, she has passed away. Her legacy continues in multiple directions with amazing women water walkers. One of the things I did want to say though is in an interview, she's carrying a copper pail, and she said that she carried the same amount of water as she went around the different lakes. And she said that depending on she could tell the different weight of the heavy metals as she walked around. And when scientists did like studies of like the water contamination, the weight that she felt carrying that for that distance was in keeping with the contamination of the water. So she has made a real impact on my being here, and hopefully in a responsible way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayumi-san. That was really powerful. Saying, you know, reconciliation is one thing, or saying that I'm a settler is one thing, but to put that on your body, to really get to know the land and to really think about and feel through the responsibility you carry as a human being and express that as an artist. It's just very, very inspiring. I keep thinking about 104 days run and 1,600 meters. So thank you so much. Now we are turning to you, participants. We have 5 minutes or so for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box. So I just read some of the comments. I'm so inspired by your presentation, Ayumi. Thank you, by Reiko. Amazing practice and reflection. Thank you so much. Well, powerful stuff. Thank you, Ayumi. Okay, somebody's asking, what has been the response from your family, Ayumi?
Oh, so my mother laughed really hard when she saw me with this bamboo attached to my head. But then it's been one of the reasons I got into performance actually was because I was witnessing a lot of truth and reconciliation. I went to a lot of gatherings of the TRC on Indian residential schools, both national and like regional events. And I didn't see a lot of people like racial minorities or like BIPOC, like the BIPOC part of BIPOC folks there, especially those who couldn't speak English or like French or the official languages. And it was a real concern for me because I knew why, like, I mean, working class folks, they couldn't go to, like farming folks too, couldn't go to the big city to participate if like my parents couldn't follow the English. Also, a number of the people that my parents sponsored had come from very traumatic circumstances, and the trauma, listening to the trauma of others would have been very, very difficult for them. So then I thought, well, I can be the conduit. I can be, you know, because instead of giving a negative critique of the TRC, I thought, well, I know what it takes to like try to build bridges between different communities in a way that won't make them feel vulnerable, hopefully not to make them feel harmed or vulnerable. So that's why I started to do performance. And so I would wear, because reconciliation is such a big kind of, not just concept, but within the Canadian context, it's so massive. Like, how does someone like my mom enter into the conversation? So I tried to bring her into the conversation by wearing her kimono as a geisha girl, which is a alter ego that I have, so that she would have to put it on me, and then she would start asking questions. Why are you dressing like a geisha? And then what is this in connection to the land and the people? So now she wouldn't have known the word like native or indigenous like before, but it's just one small step, I think, to build those bridges.
Great, thank you. There's a question. Does art and cultural creation make it easier to engage our wider Japanese Canadian communities in political justice work as opposed to just traditional advocacy? Does it feel more challenging in any ways? This might be too big of a question. I'm gonna go to Kathy. And then after that, Terry could maybe respond to that as well.
Well, I clearly think it makes it easier actually, because that's one of the reasons I do it. I think arts and culture is such an entry point and such a great way to engage people. And so I think the Powell Street Festival is a really great example of that. You, like for myself, even, right, you can come in because you like to do judo, and then, you know, the longer you get and stay around and get involved, you might think a bit more about like what the festival is about or what you're doing, and see something that was specifically political at the festival, and then decide, oh, I want to find out more and get involved. So it really feels like a great entry point.
Thank you, Kathy. Terry was involved in redress and played music through the redress movement. And also he has written, connected many generations together through his written work as well. How do you respond to this question, Terry?
Oh, well, one other thing I did was I produced plays, and one play in particular was about the internment years. It was American, but it's still, Canadians could relate to it. And we hired Robert Ito, who was, well, he was a TV star. And it was amazing how many Nisei and Sansei came out to see the play. And I mean, they were bussing in from Montreal and Hamilton and Ottawa to see it. And it was kind of subversive because those people wanted to see Robert Ito, but the message of the play, of course, was that the injustice had been done to Japanese Americans and, by extension, Japanese Canadians. And so it got them talking about it and relaxed enough to give me stories, you know. And so it's quite important that, oh, that's a nice point, that he was in Tashime, Robert Ito, that is. So it's wonderful. It's the way to do it. That's it.
Thank you so much.
I actually think about both Terry's and Kathy's like multinodal artistic practices, and I have to say, Terry, that because of your book Kuroshio, it was such an important contributing factor to a piece that that I was working with a group of artists in trying to bring the life of brothel owner Kyo Tanaka Goto, and you like the description that you used in that in your writing really helped to imagine being there. And I think that's what art does. It opens up the imagination. And Kathy, like just the multiple ways that you, like your printmaking, We Press, all of the activism in conjunction and connecting it to art, like it really sets such a like stellar example of how art expands intimate connections between people who might otherwise not engage with each other. So both are incredible.
Unfortunately, we don't have much time. Oh, Terry, did you want to say something?
I just want to say thank you very much. And it just goes to show how art pieces, whatever they may be, influences others. and creates new art pieces. And I think that's the way it should be.
Mm. There's one last question. Also, Lisa Ueda from Nikkei National Museum shared a picture of incredible photo of Robert Ito performing in the chat box.
And
Thank you.
Ayumi, I also wanted to say I really appreciate your work. It's really inspiring, and also that I saw you at the park when you did that piece with the Asahi.
Oh, yeah.
Which was amazing. So yeah, it's really I think it's really wonderful actually how these different kinds of works can help address a lot of different kinds of issues and, you know, sort of intersect in these places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sure many people still have many questions. However, we also want to have time for a small group discussion. So we must move on. And I hope after this official part of this talk is over, speakers will remain in Zoom. So if you have questions that you want to ask and you have time, you can stay on and ask questions. And also we will have Facebook page dedicated to this, and we can interact with each other more in that way as well. But now I would like to move to the breakout room. So I hope everybody stays, and the facilitator would give you directions. So it's just make sure that we know that there's so little time to share with each other. So hopefully we can all